Today I'll just discuss very briefly projects as arguments and what this means. So firstly, why projects? Well, what's fun about projects is that when you go through the courses, you learn about ideas, you learn about philosophers, you internalize these ideas, and when you do a project, you get to engage with the work. You can take a stance against the work and say, I agree with this or I don't, it's convincing or it's not, or I found a problem, but I can fix this problem in a different person's view or argument. And in this case, it's quite special. It also helps to clarify ideas, very much like when you explain it to someone else. You may read Plato's Cave 2 or 3 times, watch a video about it and think you know it. And then you want to explain this to someone else, and you realize there are a few gaps in your knowledge. So projects help you with this. And then lastly, when we create a project, we often encounter parts of our own ideas that require more development. And so you may come across an idea of epistemology or say rationalism, and you say, that's absolutely wrong. And until you craft an argument or a project, you may not be sure why you think it's wrong. You just may have a direct feeling that it's wrong. And so for these reasons, projects are useful and I think quite fun. So what is a project? I think this is the obvious question to start with. A project is a philosophy thesis. A thesis is simply a statement that is maintained. You're doing something in your project. And so an example is democracy is flawed because it leads to tyranny. That could be your thesis, and that's what your project will do. So what is this? Well, your project will argue a point. It'll argue for your thesis. And an argument is simply sort of defensible logical steps that go from true premises or convincible premises to a conclusion. The obvious example of this, only bananas are yellow and can be eaten. This is yellow and can be eaten, and so therefore it's a banana. This is not a philosophical argument. It's an argument, sure, but not philosophical, because we can simply check if it's true or false by verifying some facts. We can do some science and figure out whether what I have is a banana or not. Philosophy arguments are different. They cannot be proven, but they can be convincing. You can find Descartes' argument very convincing and you are taken with him, or you can find it unconvincing and not a good argument. And this is the way in which philosophy is judged and the strength of an argument is measured. So philosophical arguments convince. You can offer positive arguments for support or negative arguments to refute. So you can either say that, yes, Hume's view on free will is correct, and I will motivate why. Or you can say you have a problem with it, and then you can say why you try to refute his position and argue why his argument is unconvincing to you. So you can say there is free will because, or there is no free will because. Ultimately, your reader should agree with your thesis because of the reasons that you provide, the arguments, even if in the beginning they were not open to the idea or they were not positive towards it. But your arguments should lead them into a position where they say, yes, you've actually convinced me. This is something that yes. And so how do we make an argument? And this is what a paper is. Clearly state your thesis. So in this case, thesis, democracy is flawed because it leads to tyranny. Find your main premises. What are you going to use to argue this thesis? And you can say that democracy is ruled by the majority. The majority can make laws that favor the majority at the expense of a minority. And majorities tend to look after their own interests. And therefore, democracy is flawed. And so you've seen here, one of the first things I did was I defined a technical term, democracy. What is democracy? How do I understand it? Rule by the majority. I've not in this, but I should anticipate objections. For example, constitutions guarantee basic human rights for all, and so we can't exploit minorities. I need to respond to this objection to make sure that my argument is still convincing, even if someone raises this objection. And I can say a minority can be tyrannized without infringing on their formal human rights. And then I can back up my response, defend my claim, and say, for example, allocating more resources like schools to some areas and not to others does not trespass on rights, and it could still lead to tyranny. And so just a few pointers that I've come across while reading other people's papers. Sentences such as, my position is P because, is very useful because it will force you to defend and explain your position. You can say things like, Descartes is the father of modern philosophy because Berkeley's idealism is untenable. I find it unconvincing for the following reasons. And then also, if you are criticizing someone else's argument, like Berkeley, it's good to summarize the argument first and to do it quite fairly. Try and set up a neutral presentation of the argument that you will be critiquing, and then do your critique. If you set the argument up in a way that they're doomed to failure, you're not a very convincing, you haven't produced a very convincing argument, because someone else could counter your paper and say, yes, but you've set it up in a way that's not very correct or charitable to the original. And then lastly, especially in this case, a good project makes a modest point, but makes it very well. So it would be very difficult for an introduction to philosophy student in 1,000 words to prove or show or argue why philosophy is wrong. For this, you will need years and years and years. But you can take a tiny point and say, Descartes' method is very good. It's a good method to find truth. He comes very close to it. There's just one little problem I have, and I will discuss this problem clearly and in some depth.